The wagon crossed the Cheyenne River at first light, and Silas Price did not stop for the water that came in over the boards. He was a man who did not stop for anything that did not threaten his profit, and the two women chained at the wrist in the wagon bed were not his concern beyond their delivery. The chain was iron, and it had worn the skin at their wrists to something raw, and Della had stopped looking at it 3 days ago. She looked instead at the sky. It was the color of old pewter, and it did not promise anything. Hattie sat beside her and said nothing. She had not said much since the second day. Her hair was the color of new rust, and it hung across one eye, and she did not push it back. Della had learned that Hattie's silence was not emptiness. It was the silence of a woman who had spent her silence carefully and had none left to waste. The wagon lurched to a stop. Price cursed the mule and then went quiet himself. Della raised herself on one arm and looked over the sideboard. 3 riders sat their horses in the river shallows, and the water moved around the horses' legs without sound. The man in front was broad across the chest, and his hair was black and fell past his shoulders, and he wore no hat. He sat his horse the way old stone sits the earth, as if the horse were merely the ground risen up beneath him. He was looking at Price with dark eyes that did not carry anger or curiosity or anything Della could name. He was simply looking. Price said something Della could not hear. Then louder, "I've got papers on them, legal contracts." The man on the horse said nothing for a time. Then he said, "I will give you 4 horses for the contracts and the women both." Price laughed. It was not a good sound. 4 horses don't cover what I'm owed. 6 horses, the man said, and you cross back the way you came. The laugh stopped. Price was quiet for a long time, and the river moved and the mule shifted, and the morning held still around all of them. "Done," Price said. The man rode forward. He came alongside the wagon and looked down at them, at the chain between their wrists, at the raw skin beneath it. He reached into his belt and produced a knife and cut the rope that looped the chain to the wagon ring. He did not touch them. He said, "You can ride or you can walk. The camp is 2 miles north." Della looked at the knife in his hand. She looked at the cut rope. She looked at him. "Who are you?" she said. "Enape," he said. He put the knife away. He turned his horse and rode back to his men, and one of the men went with Price toward the south and the other stayed and waited. Della climbed over the sideboard. The ground was wet from the crossing and her boots sank into it. She turned and helped Hattie down. The chain swung between them and clinked, and Hattie looked at it. "He didn't take the chain," Hattie said. It was the first thing she'd said since morning. "He'll take it at camp," Della said. "Or he won't, and we'll figure that out too." They walked north. The waiting rider kept pace behind them at a distance that was neither close nor far. The grass was tall and wet, and it soaked through Della's skirt to her knees within the first 100 yards. The sky lightened slowly, as if the light itself was uncertain of its welcome. Della watched Enape ride ahead of them. His back was straight and he did not look back, and she could not tell from the set of his shoulders what he intended for them, and she was not certain that not knowing was better or worse than the things she had known before. Hattie reached out and found Della's hand with the chained one. They walked that way, 2 women and a chain and 2 miles of wet grass, into whatever came next. The camp appeared from behind a low rise, and it was larger than Della expected. Fires burned in several places, and children ran between the lodges, and dogs moved through the camp with their noses to the ground. The smell of wood smoke and something cooking reached her before they cleared the rise, and her stomach moved painfully against her ribs. Enape dismounted, and a young man took his horse. He spoke to a woman of middle age who looked at Della and Hattie with dark, calm eyes and then walked toward them. She carried a piece of iron and a small hammer, and she gestured at the chain. Della held out her wrist, and the woman worked at the link with the efficiency of someone who had done unpleasant things before and held no feeling about the necessity. The chain fell into the grass. Hattie held her wrist against her chest. The woman led them to a lodge that faced east. Inside there were 2 sleeping places laid with furs and a small fire. There was no guard at the door. The woman left and did not lock anything behind her because there was nothing to lock. Della stood in the center of the lodge and looked at the door and then at Hattie. Hattie had sat down on one of the sleeping places and was looking at her wrist where the chain had been. The skin there was purple and weeping in one spot. Della sat beside her and took the wrist in both hands and held it. She did not say anything. Outside the camp moved and lived, and the fire made its small sounds, and the light through the lodge skin was the gray of early morning gone slightly warm. "That's the first kind thing," Hattie said. Della looked at her. "No lock on the door," Hattie said. "That's the first kind thing." Della held the wrist and did not answer because there was nothing to add to that, and they both sat with it until the warmth of the fire and the exhaustion of 3 days on a wagon did what nothing else could, and Hattie was asleep before the sun had moved a hand's width across the smoke hole. Della did not sleep. She sat and listened to the camp and waited to learn what kind of place this was. She was still waiting when she finally slept too. The days settled into a shape. Morning fire, food brought by the middle-aged woman whose name was Winona, water from the river for washing. The camp moved around them like weather, and no one bothered them, and no one watched them with the particular attention that meant ownership. On the 4th morning, Della woke to the sound of a horse screaming. She came out of the lodge into cold air and pale light, and saw it immediately. A gray gelding loose at the camp's edge, the rope that had staked it trailing, the horse spooking at something in the grass and wheeling, and every time it wheeled the rope tangled further in its own legs. Men moved toward it, and the horse saw them coming and panicked harder and went sideways into the rope and nearly fell. Della did not think about it. She walked toward the horse from the far side, from the direction with no men, and she kept her eyes low and her arms loose at her sides, and she made no sound. The horse saw her and tossed its head, and she stopped and stood still and waited. She could feel the men watching her from the side. The horse blew hard through its nose, and its eye was white-rimmed and rolling, and she waited and watched the ear that turned toward her, and then the other one turned too. She walked forward again, slow. She got close enough to touch, and she reached out one hand and put it on the horse's neck and felt the shudder run through it, and she kept her hand there, and the shudder slowed and stopped. She took up the rope. She led the horse back to the camp center where the men stood watching, and she tied the rope to a stake post and stepped back, and the horse dropped its head and began to crop the thin grass. Anape stood among the men. He had been there the whole time and she had not noticed him. He looked at her. Then he looked at the horse. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "My father had horses before he had debts," she said. He nodded once. He walked away. That evening, Winona brought more food than usual, and Hattie, who had been eating in the way of someone who expected to need the reserves, ate slowly for the first time and did not hide anything in her sleeve. On the 6th day, a rider came in from the south with news that moved through the camp in a low current of voices. Della could not understand the words, but she understood the feel of it, the way the men gathered and the women pulled children closer. Anape listened to the rider and his face did not change. He spoke briefly and the men dispersed, and he went to his own lodge. Della found Winona near the fire. "What is it?" she said. "Soldiers," Winona said, "moving from the south. They will not come here, but they are moving." Della thought about that. Then she said, "Is there anything to do?" Winona looked at her. The fire popped. Winona said, "You could help me dry the meat. If they move us, we will need it done." They worked until dark, Della and Winona, and 2 other women, cutting and hanging the strips on the drying frames Winona had set up away from the main fires. It was plain work that required attention and left no room for the mind to wander far. Hattie came out after a while and joined them without being asked, and worked in her careful, quiet way that wasted nothing. Anape passed once. He looked at them without stopping and walked on. Hattie watched him go. He keeps looking at us like he's trying to figure out what we are, she said. He probably is, Della said. What do you think he decided? I don't know, Della said. She pulled a strip of meat taut on the frame. She thought about the chain that had come off without ceremony, the door with no lock, the food that came every morning. She thought about the horse and the way his eyes had gone to her hands when she brought it back and not to her face. I don't think he's decided anything yet, she said. I think he's watching. That night Della lay awake again, but the feeling that kept her awake was different now. It was not fear exactly. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something and not being certain of its depth, which is not the same as fear though it lives in the same part of the chest. The camp moved on the 9th day. Not because of the soldiers, Winona said, because the river was better upstream this time of year and the horses needed the grass there. They moved because the land required it. Della understood this in the way she understood other large facts, not with comfort but with the recognition that the world had its reasons and did not consult anyone. They broke the lodges before dawn and packed everything onto horses and travois, and by full light the camp was gone from that place as completely as if it had never been. Della and Hattie were given horses, gentle ones. Della's was a small bay mare, and she put her hand on the mare's nose and the mare breathed against her palm. The crossing was at a wide, shallow place, but the current was stronger than it looked. Della watched the first horses go through and saw how the water pushed at their legs and how the riders compensated by angling upstream. She went in behind Winona and the mare moved well beneath her until halfway across where the current deepened and the bottom was uneven and the mare lurched and found her footing again. But Della felt the cold water come up over her boot and the solid certainty of the mare's hindquarters shifting. Behind her she heard a sound. She turned. Hattie's horse had gone sideways in the current, and Hattie was in the water, and the horse was pulling away from her, and Hattie could not find her feet on the bottom, and the water was taking her. Anape was there before Della had finished turning. He came off his horse in one motion and went into the water and caught Hattie by the arm and got his feet under both of them, and he was not large about it and not gentle exactly but efficient. The way a man is efficient with something he will not allow to be lost. He brought her to the far bank and set her on her feet, and she stood with water running off her and her red hair flat against her face, and she was shaking. He looked at her, he said nothing. Hattie pushed the hair from her face and looked back at him. She was still shaking, but she held his gaze, and after a moment she said, "Thank you." He nodded. He went back into the river and caught his horse. Della reached the far bank and dismounted and came to Hattie and put her hands on Hattie's face and looked at her. "I'm all right," Hattie said. "I know," Della said. Hattie looked past her to where Anape was leading his horse out of the river. She watched him the way she watched things she was trying to understand, with all of herself, and none of the understanding showing yet. They made camp that night in a bend of the river where cottonwoods broke the wind. Hattie's clothes were dry by firelight, and she sat close to the fire and said little, but when Anape passed near their fire on his way to speak with two of his men, she looked up and he looked at her, and she did not look away. He continued on to his men. Della saw it. She said nothing. She fed sticks to the fire one at a time and thought about the river and the speed with which he had gone in after her and the way he had set Hattie on her feet, as if that were the only possible outcome of the whole thing. "Hattie," she said. "What?" "Nothing," Della said. "Go to sleep." On the 3rd day at the new camp, Anape came to them before midday. He had 2 horses saddled and he said, "Come." He did not explain further. They rode with him north and west to a ridge that rose above the surrounding plain, and from the top of it the land opened in every direction, grass and sky, and the thread of the river below. The wind was different up here, not the low push of the plain but something that moved in long pulls from the northwest. Anape stood at the edge of the ridge and looked northwest. He was still for a long time. Della stood beside him and looked where he was looking. She saw clouds on the horizon, low and dark, and moving in a way that was not like the clouds that brought ordinary rain. "Storm," she said. "Tonight," he said, "maybe before tonight." He turned back to the horses and took something from his saddlebag, a strip of dried meat for each of them, which he held out without ceremony. Hattie took hers and ate it. Della took hers and held it. "You brought us up here to see it," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He considered that for a moment. The wind moved his hair and he put it back behind one ear. He said, "Because you have been here long enough to know where the camp is. If a storm comes bad in the night and you need to move, you need to know where the high ground is." Della looked at him. He was looking back at the storm on the horizon. "That's not a kindness," she said. "That's practical." "Yes," he said. She ate the meat. They rode back, and the whole of the afternoon was given over to the camp preparing for the storm. The lodge skins were tightened, and the stakes driven deeper, and the drying frames were taken down, and the horses brought to a sheltered place below the cutbank. Della and Hattie worked with the other women, and Della found that she knew what to do before Winona told her, because she had spent her life reading weather and reading the consequences of its neglect. At one point she was driving a stake with a rock, and the stake was angling wrong, and Anape knelt beside her and put his hands around the stake and straightened it. He held it while she drove it. His hands were close to hers, and she could see the old scars across the knuckles, one deep one that had taken time to heal, and the steadiness with which he held the stake still. She drove it to the ground and sat back. He stood and moved to the next stake. The storm came at dusk, and it was a real storm, the kind that makes the lodge skin breathe in and out like something alive. The rain was hard, and the lightning came down on the plain south of them, and the thunder rolled through the ground and up through everything sitting on it. Della lay in the dark of the lodge and listened to the storm and listened to Hattie breathing on the other side of the fire. Hattie was asleep. She slept without flinching now, through sounds that would have jolted her awake 2 weeks ago. Della watched the firelight on the lodge skin and listened to the thunder move off to the east. She thought about his hands on the stake, the scar across his knuckles, the way he had said, "Because you need to know where the high ground is," as if their safety were a thing he had already decided on and was simply working through the practical requirements of it. She put her hand on the ground beside her sleeping place. The earth was dry in here, the storm locked out by hides and stakes and the work of the afternoon. She could feel the faint tremor of thunder through the ground. Outside, the rain continued. Hattie turned in her sleep, and her breath went slow and even again. Della withdrew her hand from the ground and looked at the ceiling of the lodge where the smoke rose and the firelight made its small shifting patterns, and she lay with her eyes open for a long time, which was nothing new, except that what was different was the reason. It was not fear that kept her awake.